Ben Schmidt nos contará sobre cómo los smart contracts de Ethereum están llenos de bugs y sobre cómo funciona una nueva tendencia que apunta a hacerlos parecer vulnerables cuando en realidad son exploits ofensivos para quienes intenten aprovecharse de ellos.
Hi everyone, my name is Ben Schmidt. I am the Chief Security Officer at Polyswarm, where we are building a decentralized threat intelligence platform where security experts can join up, share what they know about existing threats, and make money doing so. If you're interested in that sort of thing, come talk to me after the talk. But today, I'm going to be talking about smart contract honeypots, so let's jump right in. Of course. I'm going to move back here to click through this. So what are smart contract honeypots? Well, they're basically vulnerable Ethereum contracts that people think are vulnerable, but actually aren't. When people go to send money into these contracts to try and exploit them, they actually get their money stuck in the contracts, and the attacker that deployed them withdraws the funds and they lose everything. Today I'm only going to be talking about ones that have actually been seen in the wild, and people have actually lost money trying to exploit these things. So what this talk doesn't cover is how to find honeypots. I'm hoping to talk on that in the future, but today we won't be doing that. I won't be talking about scams that aren't actually about hacking would-be attackers. There's a lot of those, but don't have time for them. And I'm definitely not talking about the legal status of this, but I would say don't try to do anything that is presented in this talk. So the first thing we need to do is actually go over Ethereum Solidity, how it works. So funds in Ethereum are tracked by accounts. So you can think about this as a bank account. You have a public-private key that allows you to send, receive funds, and it's basically every cryptocurrency you've ever heard of. In addition to these external accounts that are normal user accounts, however, there's also a contract account. Now, these contracts are actually just code and data that get to execute arbitrary things that control where these funds go. Now, these transactions that people are sending on the network are essentially just proposing changes to the state of the chain. These are hopefully valid, and the miners are tasked with confirming that they are. The fees that the miners collect for doing all these confirmations are paid for in what's known as gas, which is paid for in Ether. Now, this rate is set by miners at a market rate. It fluctuates all the time. If there's lots of crypto kitties on the network, you could be looking at pretty expensive transactions, but generally it's pretty cheap. When a transaction is confirmed, the changes to the state of the transaction of the chain that was proposed by the transaction are confirmed by the net, and the entire network acceptance is valid. Sorry. So all contracts are executed on the EVM. So the code that is actually deployed is a simple bytecode that gets interpreted by this EVM. And each instruction actually has an associated gas cost to it. So whenever you're running this code, every single instruction that gets executed, every change you make to the state of the chain costs money. So you can do fairly arbitrary calculations, but if it's too expensive, your transaction is going to be rejected because you don't have enough money. So Solidity is what most people actually use to write smart contracts. So it targets the EVM, but people aren't actually directly writing this bytecode, generally speaking. It's a statically typed, Turing-complete, JavaScript-like language that is used to manage the flow of money in these contract accounts. So a lot has been said about this language. It's got a lot of rough edges, and we'll see later it can be pretty unintuitive what some of the code is actually doing. So each one of these contracts has a constructor that gets run only when you deploy the contract. And this is to initialize the state of the contract storage. So it sets everything up to the initial state that you want it to and gets everything ready for running transactions in the future. All the other functions in the contract are publicly visible and callable by default. So you can, anyone that is talking to the Ethereum mainnet can call random functions and execute things unless they're explicitly marked that you can't do that. Each contract also has one unnamed function called the fallback function, and this function essentially lets you handle simple fund transfers. So if someone in an external account sends money to this contract and they don't specify what function to call, they specify a function that doesn't actually exist in the dispatch table, this function gets called. In general, you can't do very much here because you can't count on having very much gas to pay for things, but you can do some fun tricks with external accounts sometimes. So functions are called by sending a transaction that has associated transaction data. Now this transaction data is a pretty simple format that's well documented, but essentially starts with a method ID which tells this dispatch table in your smart contract which function to actually execute, and provides all the parameters necessary to run that function. So actually building these, most people don't build them directly. They use Web3, which is a library for interacting with these things, for calling these functions. But if you're reverse engineering, transactions that other people sent to things that you don't have source code for, you might have to guess a little bit. But in general, it's pretty easy to figure out. In addition to external accounts being able to call into these contracts, contracts can actually call into other contracts. So you can create fairly complex chains of you call into a contract and then that contract calls some other contract that manages some other state that you're interested in, and maybe that contract calls into yet another contract to do something else. So what this allows you to do is you can create things like library contracts where you have a contract that has a minimal amount of code but calls into a library that has a lot more code. And what that does is saves you a lot of money whenever you're deploying these things. So this is an example of actually an exploit, but it's a single contract calling into another contract, and that contract is actually calling back into the original contract. Basically, you can do this as much as you want as long as you have enough money to do so. All contracts, in addition to the code that is deployed, are also able to store state in between transactions. So what this means is you can store balances, you can keep track of data that people want stored permanently on this chain, et cetera, et cetera. So storage is the aptly named place where all this data resides on the chain. And all it is a simple key value store that is unique to each contract account that maps 256-bit words to other 256-bit words. There are two other types of memory, memory and the stack, that are also available in the EVM. However, these are non-persistent. That means it's much cheaper to use them because you don't have to pay the storage costs associating with storing data on the chain. However, obviously things don't stay around after the transaction. By default, everything goes into storage, and you have to explicitly say that it's not going to be put there so you can save money. So there's a bunch of different potential issues with writing these smart contracts. The ones that are sort of relevant today are unhandled reentrant control flow. This was what caused the hack of the DAO, which caused about 3.6 million Ether being stolen a while back. That was essentially a very simple problem. So there was a contract that allowed you, that was maintaining balances that users had. Now, anytime you wanted to withdraw, however, it would actually potentially call into some random other contract, which could be potentially be attacker controlled. And unfortunately, they didn't actually update the balances of their users before they called into this contract. And this was a withdrawal function that was sending funds to this attacker, potentially attacker-controlled address. So the attacker could then call right back into this withdrawal function and continuously drain the account of all the funds that were in it, even if they weren't theirs. Another potential problem are delegate calls into vulnerable libraries. So the Parody Hack was another big one for where there was a hack for a Parody multi-signature wallet, which allows multiple people to have to sign off on funds being moved in and out of a wallet. Unfortunately, they used delegate call, which allows you to essentially call into a library as if it was the same contract that you were calling it from. So that allowed you to basically call any function in this library as if you were the current account. Unfortunately, there were some functions that were not protected that you could actually call directly into, and one of them allowed you to reinitialize the wallet. So you could mark yourself as the sole owner of this multi-signature wallet and then withdraw all the funds. They ran into yet another problem a couple months later with unprotected critical functions, where they now weren't allowing people to delegate call directly into this thing, but they were exposing functions that were potentially dangerous to call. The same initialize function could still be used to set yourself as an owner, and if you called directly into this library contract, which was uninitialized, you could set yourself as an owner and then kill the contract. This meant that any wallet that depended on it no longer functioned, which means you couldn't move any of the funds, which obviously is pretty bad. And finally, the other vulnerability is secret handling. So gambling apps are probably the most popular application right now of smart contracts. And one of the big problems with using public blockchains is actually figuring out how to do secret generation. So gambling apps obviously need secrets to choose random winners for various games. Unfortunately, a lot of them either generate those secrets improperly in a way that doesn't have enough entropy, or they also will sometimes store secrets on the public chain thinking that they're not actually accessible when they really are. So there's a bunch of tools for Ethereum analysis. Most of what I'm going to focus on today is etherscan.io, which is by far the most popular block explorer for the Ethereum blockchain. And what it allows you to do, if you're not familiar with block explorers, is poke through all the transactions, all the blocks that have been published. You can get a bunch of information about the smart contracts that have been pushed up there. And basically, it tries to give you a nice, user-friendly way to view everything that's happening on the chain. Unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't quite display information correctly, or it displays it in a way that's kind of confusing. So I definitely recommend checking out all these other tools if you're interested in smart contract stuff, but I'm not really going to talk about them today. So now on to smart contracts, now that you're all experts. So irrevocable transfers plus really poorly written code basically equals free money to a lot of people. So people were seeing all these large, high-profile hacks where people are stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. And obviously, there were a lot of attackers who saw dollar signs and started looking through everything to try and find things that were vulnerable to these same issues so they could find the next parody or the next DAO. So there's a lot of people who really want to find these things, and some people realized this and realized that there was an opportunity to attack some of these new people that were coming in to this ecosystem. So because Ethereum Solidity have a lot of unintuitive behaviors, Etherscan, doesn't quite display things correctly, it makes it very easy to obfuscate intent. So basically, Ethereum honeypots became this interesting trend where they look vulnerable, but they're actually trying to exploit the people exploiting. And without fail, in some way, they require the would-be attacker to send money to this contract, and they fail to exploit it, and the person who deployed the contract can withdraw it and make money. So I got interested in this because of a challenge that we were running at Hack in the Box Amsterdam. And in this challenge, we had a pretty obviously vulnerable wallet that was called HODL Wallet. So The bug was classic reentrancy, very similar to the DAO, but much more simple to actually go about exploiting in practice. Every person who was participating had to come to our booth, get a private key that actually already had a balance, and the whole point of the game was to withdraw all the funds rather than a very, very small amount of funds that the contract was trying to limit them to. So you were only allowed to withdraw 3 times, and you could only withdraw a very, very small amount of Ether, but there was significantly more in there. So by writing an exploitative contract, you could actually call back into this withdraw function many, many times, and the balances wouldn't actually get updated every time it get called. So you could withdraw the whole user account balance without actually hitting your withdrawal limit. So the interesting part about this is you couldn't actually withdraw all these funds unless you already had one of these accounts. However, that didn't stop someone from attempting to compromise this. So someone was clearly looking for vulnerable contracts that had a certain amount of ETH in them, and someone started probing this contract that I deployed literally less than an hour after I had deployed it. So was watching this would-be attacker, submitting money directly to my contract and failing to actually exploit the bug that he thought he saw in it. So I got very interested in whether or not this sort of thing was common and whether or not there were people who were actually trying to take advantage of these people that were doing this. Well, the answer turns out, of course, yes. So there was something that was significantly more malicious but very similar called the private bank that got published. So this guy named Currency Tycoon posted on Reddit about some contract that he found. He was going to try and exploit it, and it turned out that he couldn't actually do it. The contract had the same vulnerability, a reentrancy vulnerability, and it allowed you to call into an attacker-controlled contract, and it looked like you'd be able to withdraw all your money, all the money in the contract. In addition, whenever you looked at this on Etherscan, it showed the person who had deployed the contract upload the source code, and it was verified as being the exact same code. So what that means is that Etherscan compiled the contract, the bytecode matched exactly what was deployed on the chain, and it accepted it as the correct source code for this particular contract. Well, the person who was trying to exploit this actually copy-pasted this code, deployed it on testnet, wrote an exploit, and it worked. But whenever he tried to do it on the mainnet, it looked like it was working, but he never actually got any funds. So interestingly, about 15 minutes later, someone else exploited the same exact bug that they were trying to exploit. However, it actually succeeded, and they got money from it. So why would this ever be the case? Well, the problem here are these internal transactions, these message calls between contracts. So the transferred log function in this contract that gets called right after the balances are updated looks like it's just logging information about the withdrawal. The source code that was provided looks entirely benign. However, because it's calling into another contract, it's actually not safe, and it's entirely wrong. So in actuality, it was calling into a contract that had been deployed, but the source code had no correlation whatsoever to what was actually provided to Etherscan. So when you actually look at the bytecode, it doesn't match up at all. This is possible because whenever Etherscan validates this source code that's been uploaded, they don't actually validate that contracts that they're calling into are the same as the API that provided. All it cares is that the function signatures are the same. Well, that obviously changes a lot of people's expectations, but a lot of people don't know that. So you can basically swap out what code is actually running and have it still look like it's completely validated. So a far simpler approach that someone took was, yet again, uploading some source code to Etherscan after they deployed their contract. Their contract, whenever you looked at it, it looked like it would just allow you to withdraw the entire balance of the account. However, to withdraw it, you had to send at least 1 Ether into this contract. Well, What you didn't see in the Explorer was something about 10,000 spaces off to the side that before it transferred you money would actually transfer all the money in the contract to the person who originally deployed it. And because they actually didn't display the slider correctly, you wouldn't have seen this at all. They've since fixed that, but it's still not entirely obvious what's going on. So even simpler than this, though, someone named the Shitcoin Sherpa talked about a enterprising user that he saw in a chat room who was asking for help and accidentally posted his private key in this public chat room. Well, clearly there are a lot of not great people on the internet, so some of these people tried to steal money from this account. Now, this account had a bunch of Ethereum tokens in it. And the way Ethereum ERC20 tokens work is essentially you have a smart contract that manages it and maintains balances of these tokens. So what happens when you transfer these tokens is you actually still have to pay gas fee to send them around. So what this account didn't have was any ether to actually spend these tokens. So to steal them, people had to add funds into this account and then to actually move the tokens to their account and withdraw them. What these people didn't know is that the person who was posting this private key in all these chat rooms was actually had a script running that would immediately transfer any funds that got sent into the account back to his own user-controlled wallet. What they also didn't know is that they had chosen this specific token because you could actually lock the tokens in a way that people with access to the account actually couldn't move them. So the available balance to transfer was actually basically nothing, but it looked, whenever you looked at anything that allowed you to monitor balances of ERC20 tokens, like there were $20,000 worth of tokens there available. So this might be the most technically interesting to me. It was a gambling application that got deployed called Crypto Roulette. Now, this was a gambling application through and through. You guess the right number, you win all the ETH. So this contract already would have looked interesting to an attacker because it had a poor secret generation mechanism that was probably gameable. However, even worse, they actually stored the secret that was going to be used whenever they determined who won on the chain, and it wasn't updated until after the last payout. So in theory, you could look at the chain, know what the secret was going to be, and guess the right number and get all the money. So what's wrong? The issue here is that they were using an uninitialized struct called a game struct. Now, in Ethereum, in Solidity, whenever you have an uninitialized struct, it actually defaults to pointing to the 0th slot in the storage. Now, what that essentially means is that you could end up writing to random variables that you don't actually mean to write to unless you actually initialize it. So in this particular instance, whenever they went about initializing this struct in the function, rather than writing to some structure that should have already existed, they were actually overwriting the secret number that everyone was seeing on the chain. And then, whenever the play ended, they were rewriting another sane-looking number back. What this effectively meant is there was no way to ever win this, but people would continue to send ETH to the contract to try and win the game. And finally, the last one that I'm going to talk about is something called Multiplicator X3. It was one of the earliest ones that was deployed sometime around late 2017. But basically what it was trying to do is you'd send in a certain amount of money, and it was greater than the total. If that amount of money was greater than what was actually stored in the contract, it would transfer the entire balance of the contract to the person who had sent that transaction. This is actually a really simple thing if you've read through the Solidity documents, but actually what happens is that message.value can never actually be greater than this .balance, because this .balance, the balance of the contract account, is actually updated whenever you get before the function is actually called. So in this case, you can actually transfer all these funds, whenever you think you're going to transfer all these funds out, nothing actually happens because that check is impossible to satisfy. So the attacker just sat there, waited for people to try and take the money out, and then extracted it. So those are a few examples of some of the more interesting smart contract honeypots. It's pretty undeniable that it's kind of satisfying to watch attackers get attacked, but these contracts do kind of demonstrate some pretty serious issues in the ecosystem with displaying what's actually happening versus what it kind of looks like is happening. So there's lots of work to be done to make Solidity a little more intuitive and explicit in how it behaves, but also Explorer tools need to be a lot more careful whenever they're displaying data, especially when it comes to displaying quote-unquote verified source code, which definitely gives people a much bigger sense of security than they should actually have. So that's more or less my talk. If you have any other interesting examples of honeypots that you see out in the wild, let us know. At Polyswarm, you can find me at @_supernothing. And you can find this slide deck online.